Hi, my name is Sai, and I'm a second year PhD student at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Thank you today for joining us for our paper talk titled A Visual Ethnographic Study at Cultural Spaces to Identify Character Creation Opportunities. This paper is authored by myself, Sastat Maram, and my co authors Johannes Fau, Jay Tatecheni, and Maggie Saif Al Nasir, who is also my advisor and the chair of the Gaming User Intelligence and Interaction Lab at UC Santa Cruz. So, what do we do in this paper? Why are we even interested in designing, exploring character creation opportunities? The motivation behind this paper is that game design is becoming agile, and the bottleneck towards creativity shifts towards designers and narrative designers. Since we need to support them to design better characters and better narratives, this is where our paper is intended and targeted for. Literature has shown that mythology and culture have been proven sources of inspiration for development of characters and narratives. And what this has led to is gaming studios have often copied religious and mythological characters in games. This results into two major problems. One, it creates a pragmatic upper cap on the number of characters that can be borrowed because every religion has n number of gods or n number of characters which you can borrow. And then, secondly, and the most important one, is there's a constant backlash from religious communities on using these gods, especially from active religions in video games, because they go against their belief system, their stories, and the character symbolization as such. So, how do we solve this, right? And this is where we really step up and we say that we're going to use a UX approach. We use the classic five-step design thinking approach, where we start with empathizing the problem, defining the problem, ideating, prototyping, and finally evaluating our solution. So, we use a UX research framework and we see how we can kind of solve this problem. So, to even understand the intensity of the problem, so we believe that it's important to understand where the intensity of the problem before you even understand the merit of the solution, right? So, in our first step, to empathize, we did some interviews with cultural stakeholders, which kind of builds up from our previous work at ICC. And we saw that the cultural stakeholders are very clear and adamant, saying that enjoyment does not come at the cost of poor representation of their deities or their gods, and there is a trade-off of immersion, and culture, and the game clearly marks it as a Hindu deity and portrays that particular character as bad. People say that this is not inspiration, this is blatant copying and pretty insulting. Then we move on to understand what do people on Reddit, especially people who play games, feel about it, not just the cultural stakeholders, but also taking a standpoint or getting the perspective of people who play games. And we see that some gamers did in fact come forward and kind of raise this concern that they are not in good consciousness while they play this game, or seeing a god kill other characters is against their belief system, and they were pretty much against, or not, at least they were not comfortable playing those characters, right? And they pretty much had to hide their gaming habits from their family because it was treated blasphemous, or it was considered sin in their religion to play these characters. So we further went on to look into academic literature, and we saw two bodies of literature when it comes to religion and digital play. And the first body of work is talks about the perception of religious symbolism, the perception of theology, religion, and cultural references by gamers when they see these things in games, right? And the second set of research was basically looking at design literature, where we saw researchers coming up with design taxonomies, design frameworks, systematic reviews of games to see what are the different mechanics and design elements which have been used in games. So, where what we realized from here is that video game characters need to be sensitive yet creative. So the question really comes up, and then we define our problem here as, can cultural spaces inform the design of culturally sensitive characters, but at the same time, they need to be novel so that video games are engaging and immersive. So in this process, we wanted to identify what can we do, right? So the first step we did was a generative step, and so basically we have a framework which constitutes of a generative step and an evaluative step. And in the generative step, we wanted to propose an alternative to the god transplantation, which was happening currently. Like, you transplant god from mythology religion into games. Instead, we employed an ethnographic and grounded theory approach to identify granular artifacts from religions, and then that can be used to support characters. So we hypothesize that character creation can be treated as a syntagm and paradigm approach. Like, for example, when you say man eats an octopus, the subject is the man, and the predicate is the octopus. But you can actually interchange these two, and the sentence still makes sense in its own way. So we feel that every character has certain paradigms, and we can fill that paradigms with syntagms. So our first step was we visit cultural spaces to do visual ethnography. That's the ethnographic step, and then we move on to do a grounded theory, where we do open coding, actual coding, selective coding, and then we finally come up with this sentiment and paradigm based design space. So the goal is that designers can use this design space to create a combination of characters using using some permutations of these syntagms. So we go on further. So when we went to the temples, we went to temples in Sunnyvale in the United States. We collected 429 images, and out of that 429 images, 248 images were of images of idols, 63 images were of ongoing rituals, devotees, and 45 images were miscellaneous objects. Yes, we do talk about Hindu mythology in this particular case study, but you're free to use this framework of visual ethnography and grounded theory in any cultural space. So at this point, we wanted to say that, hey, here is a framework, and we're applying this framework on a Hindu space, and what design space does it give us, right? So when we went to the temples, we took our pictures. We apply the grounded theory on the images. So for example, you see an image of a goddess here, and we break down what the goddess offers in terms of visual aesthetic, right? It could be bangles, necklace, crown, so on, so on. And these kind of like funnel down into some actual codes, such as there could be headgear, there's clothing for the torsos, jewelry, weapon systems, facial features, limbs, and then they further distill down into some selective codes, such as fashion elements, weapon systems, and physical attributes, right? So our intention is people use these actions, these open codes and selective codes and actual codes, to create characters instead of, rather than just copying gods, right? So what we did is we present this design space on it on to designers. Like, we kind of cut them up, and we place them on tables, and this distribution allows designers to pick suitable syntagms from the respective paradigms and help in character creation. So when we asked designers to come forward and create characters, they were allowed to select any number of syntagms and arrange them in any format they like to create new characters. So what we did here was, to evaluate it, we conducted a participatory design study to see that, hey, does the design space even help people build characters? Followed by that, we proposed some quantitative metrics, which we will discuss further, to evaluate the novelty of these characters. And then we followed up with the qualitative interviews with stakeholders, to see that these characters are culturally sensitive. So the first step of our evaluation process was to use a participatory design workshop. So we invited some designers who were taking courses in game design to build new characters using this design space. So you see here, you can see like people are building, they kind of arrange these syntagms to create new characters. And when we kind of like drew them out, you see 6 characters, 3 participants built, right? So we asked them to generate 2 characters each, and they went about generating that. So after that, now what this then this the step of our quantitative frameworks kind of kicks in. The beauty of proposing this design space in the form of a syntagm and paradigm approach is that you can create vectors of which kind of represent the character. For example, I'll be clear again. When you see the character vector 1, it does not contain any wings, so that particular syntagm would have 0 frequency, while in character vector 2, this particular character has 2 wings, so that you would put the number 2, the frequency 2, in that syntagm. The count of that syntagm would be what each element in that vector represents. So now this kind of gives me an embedding to each character, and what this does is that it allows me to compute distances between 2 characters, which is pretty new in the field of character design, right? Creating character embeddings and then trying to compare characters, which we borrow from NLP technically. So what this does is we create a base character, like the origin character, and then we compute distances from other characters, right? So for example, here in this case, we choose the basic male character to be the origin. This is purely because of the fact that they to build the basic male character, it requires the minimum number of elements from that Hindu design space. And then we represent each character in that design space as points, and we compute distances. So if you look at the first 3 quadrants, almost, these are characters which are copied from Hindu mythology in video games, and the last quadrant is characters which the participants, I mean, we created using the participated design competition, participated design workshop. And in this process, what happens, we see that participant generated characters are further away from the origin in terms of distance compared to the original gods, which we want to argue for novelty, saying that they deviate higher, they're at further distance from the origin compared to original gods, hence they are more novel. but we wanted to compare across the different selective codes, like because each character constitutes of some physical attributes, some fashion attributes, some weapon attributes, and some game mechanics attributes. We explicitly found that participant generated characters deviate greatly in the overall design space, claiming that we are much more novel than existing gods which are copied into games. But also we have the same stand for physical space and weapon systems, as well as where we have like a p-value of less than 0.05, showing great distinction between the two groups of characters. And when I say groups, group one is basically the participant generated characters, and group two is basically characters copied from Hindu mythology into video games. But when it came to the fashion space and weapon space, we have our insights. Our insights technically say that yes, overall we do perform better than copying gods. But when it came to characters in terms of fashion and game mechanics, what we see is that a lot of characters copied in original games come from a royal backdrop, so they're richly adorned with jewels and a lot of fashion elements, while participant generated characters are they're more zoomorphic in nature and animal nature, so they're not adorned with fashion. And that is why copied gods have a higher sense of fashion compared to our participant generated gods. Similarly, in when it came to game mechanics, since there a lot of copied gods are human in nature, they have animal transportation mechanics, or mechanics which make them faster, while participant generated gods are already zoomorphic in nature and they do not have transport mechanisms as such. So that is the reason we see that in terms of purely fashion and game mechanics, original gods do better. But when it comes to the overall standing in the design space, the physical features, the combat systems, participant generated characters are way better. Finally, to evaluate, right, are these characters sensitive or not, what we do is we do a sensitivity evaluation with stakeholders. So we give them an A/B test kind of situation, where we give them gods copied from the Hindu mythology, and B, we give them participant generated characters. We asked for their opinions in terms of if they're offended by it, what do they think about it, what is the narrative behind it. And then we see that when you see when they were responding to its copied original gods, they talk about how they identify with the legend of the god, or the story and the narrative of the god, the worship of the god, and seeing them in game is not something they're happy with, right? And as a religion, Hinduism believes that they lay their destiny in the fate of gods, but you controlling gods with keyboards is not something they're very comfortable with. And also the projection of the god in terms of the original narrative. For example, a particular stakeholder says that Krishna is almighty and invincible, but in this game he's shown as a bad guy, and you fight against him. Imagine what the next generation of kids will think and learn. They are concerned with the originality and the authenticity of the narrative associated with the god being distorted by video games as a form of media. But when we show participant generated characters, it is pretty evident that they do not relate to the character because it's fictional and hypothetical, and they wouldn't have a problem with that being used in games, and the concept of death and mortality being associated with that fictional element or fictional god, right? So you can lose with that creature you create, right, instead of losing with the original god. They're much more happier with that. Right? These creatures are a combination of things borrowed. Items, they might hold cultural value, but as creatures, I'm not worried about them and what happens to the character. I do not see myself worshipping them because there is no mythological story or god that exists which I can relate to. So that is where we see the difference here. And if I had to like draw some insights, that participant generated characters overall were received much more positively than the stakeholders, but the cultural stakeholders did voice out a strong opinion against using original gods in video games, right? So cultural stakeholders were concerned with narratives associated with the original gods, but because they were being manipulated through media, through video games. But they shared that the creative liberty should not be used against these gods, but you could have creative liberty over fictional elements and participant generated characters. That's all from my side. Thank you for your listening, and I'm happy to take any questions in Discord, or some of my co-authors are there. They'd be happy to answer questions. Have a good day. Thank you.